And now we present to you Thac0 with Advantage.
Welcome to Thac0 with Advantage. We're two friends that have been playing D&D a long time. While we both love lots of other RPGs, D&D gives us permission to be social with people we don't already know. Hey there, I'm Ange, and I started my time in this hobby as an awkward kid obsessed with my imagination, and it helped me grow into an awkward adult obsessed with my imagination, but with a huge number of like-minded friends. Oh, I also write for Gnome Stew and do the Gnomecast too.
I'm Jared, and I promise I really do run games, just not right now. Any day now, new game, coming up soon. Until then, you can find things that I've written at gnomestew.com and whatdoiknowjr.com. After we look at the games we're running in the campaign journal, we'll be talking about social encounters and how to make them more than just a single persuasion check. Then we'll have some recommendations of D&D related content for you to check out in our downtime research segment.
Now stand by for station identification. This is WD&D the Role Player. Now we're going to McElroy McKinney and the Bardic College.
Comeliness was a short-lived ability score that originally showed up in Unearthed Arcana in AD&D 1st edition. It was an ability score expressly for determining how attractive your character was. While the ability score was removed from AD&D 2nd edition, it did show up in multiple places in AD&D 1st edition, including Dragon Magazine number 110, where we learned that Elminster's Comeliness was 12. Because of I10 Ravenloft 2, the House on Gryphon Hill, we know that Strahd had a Comeliness of 16. Comeliness also appeared in the World of Greyhawk box set from AD&D 1st edition, expressly so we could find out the Comeliness scores of the Quasi-Deities of that setting. But not any of the gods that appear later in the same book. I wonder how many points of damage you'd have to do to yourself with a hammer to raise your Comeliness score. Let me just finish up this campaign journal.
Wow, it feels a little light in the journal since City of Cowls and Marodi both wrapped up. I also have Victoriana on hold for the month of April, but we did get to play the old Margrave. Since I skipped talking about that last episode, I'll get us caught up there. When we last left the cohort of the Crossroads, a name they've been workshopping together, they had retrieved the newly hatched griffin babies from Still Tower and made their escape into the woods with a bunch of goblinoids chasing them. They had a pretty good lead on the goblinoids, but were definitely being careful to try and avoid any encounters with them. I did nudge them on making sure they were taking care of the baby griffins. Some of them seemed to think that just throwing meat in the bags they had the babies in was going to be enough. And I'm like, guys, no, that's not how baby birds are fed. I had them check in and realize, no, they just now had baby birds covered in meat juices because they just threw meat in the bag. You know, I told them that the imprinting was kind of based on eye contact.
Yeah.
And therefore, ever afterwards, they treated the baby griffins like they were basilisks. Like a single moment of eye contact would be enough to imprint the baby on them. And I'm like, that's not how, okay. But still, they kept them fed, made sure they were okay, tried to avoid getting seen. You know, it was a little exhausting, but hey, that's this group. They tend to make things way more complicated than they need to be. I have to live with this. They camped using Tiny Hut in a well-concealed spot and then continued on. Part of their way to the meeting point with LeShark, the mama, they were confronted by 3 bedraggled griffins that could smell the babies. So they thought the PCs had stolen the babies. And, well, my players thought these griffins could talk like LeShark does, and I had to kind of point out, no, she's an awakened griffin. These guys have animal-level intelligence. So Turvin cast Speak with Animals and then kind of started explaining what was going on, got them calm enough that they were talking and getting ready to go when goblins showed up and attacked them. The fight was a cakewalk because they literally just wiped them out. One fireball, they were refreshed. So one fireball, most of them are gone. They took out the ogre before, it swang once. They could have handled all the goblins at the tower, but they were trying to be careful, and they're like, we have babies with us, we can't fight them. And I'm like, I'm not going to be the bad guy that suddenly says, oops, you killed the babies because you stayed to fight. No, I wouldn't have done that, but still, like, they took the goblins out super easily. Moved on, met up with the shark. She was grateful that the babies were safe and fed, and she rewarded them with a promise to return a favor in the future should they call on her. She also asked Turvin, the elf, if he was one of the elves from the group north of the tower. This was my hook for a future adventure, and they almost hand-waved it away. Turvin's like, no, I'm not one of them. And then, where are we going now, guys? And, they're like, well, I guess it's interesting that there's some elves up there that she says she hasn't seen in a while. I don't know. Well, we can head back to Zobek or something.
Why does this hook have a sign on it that says take the hook?
Zartath's player looked at them. He's like, or, maybe we could just take the hook and go check on it now since we don't have anywhere else to be. I love them, but sometimes they are the bane of my existence. We picked up in our most recent session with them having taken a couple of days to basically rest at the Eye of the Forest Inn before setting off to go try and find the elves. This session was mostly travel, but they did do some investigation. The funny thing is we're at the inn, and I'm asking them, so what are you doing for your 2 days? And I'm getting like, somebody's working on this, somebody's working on this. Nobody's thinking, maybe I should ask some questions about elves. Finally, they're like, last little second before they're about to set off. It's like, oh, I guess maybe I should have asked somebody about if they knew anything about the elves to the north. And I'm like, hey, ding, 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 ding. So there was some social, engagement going on, and they found one of the cooks, an elderly cook. Her father had stories of elves that lived in the woods, and they got the hint there that those elves are actually dark elves. They're drow, and kind of pointed out to them the history of the drow. The drow don't live in the Underdark anymore because the ghouls drove them out. And so if there are any drow out there, they are generally refugees, not the big bads we're used to from Forgotten Realms.
Yeah.
So they set off into the woods. They decided to kind of head in the direction of the tower, because then they could basically reroute to go towards the north and see if they could start finding more clues along the way. I did end up giving them a straggler group of goblinoids to take out. This time the ogre never even got a chance to swing their club. I had them traveling like a dry riverbed, and the party rolled well enough that they snuck up on them and were able to get in front of them, and Zartath jumped down into the riverbed and did a lightning bolt down the thing and just, took out most of the little ones. There were a couple of I think the whole thing lasted 4 rounds, and that was because there were a couple of the ones that didn't get hit with the lightning bolt that were a little smarter. Either way. I also had them have an encounter with a giant 6-legged toad thing called a Bukavak. That was actually a fun fight. They handled it easily, but it could have hurt them pretty bad if they hadn't have been a little smart about it. Like, it hit hard with its abilities. They also had a non-combat encounter with a Kotboyan, which is a shadow fae large cat that doesn't like elves or blink dogs. So it snarked with them for a bit and let them know that there were ruins between them and the elves they were trying to find, which made Zartath very excited because he's basically take a kobold and take Indiana Jones and mash them together, and you have our little kobold wizard. Both of those things are actually suggested in the random encounter tables of the old Margrave book. I don't know if it's the new Margrave book or the old Margrave book, the old Margrave book, but both of those were referenced in there, so that's what it. So next session, we should pick up with them arriving at the ruins, where I have a whole bunch of fun things in store for them.
It is funny when you talk about the, not knowing where to go next and not necessarily taking the hook, because I run into that a little bit in the Curse of Strahd game that I'm running, but that campaign is set up. Like, there are things you are supposed to do, but there's not an order that you have to do them in.
Yeah.
So I kind of get it there, because then it's sort of like, okay, should we have done this before we do this? As opposed to a more linear where it's like, well, yeah, you should probably just do the next thing.
Yeah, and I did have a conversation with Zartath and Malvern's players on the way to the little gaming gathering we went to a couple weekends ago. And Mal kind of pointed out, he's like, we don't have an overarching purpose. You know, like the group doesn't really have a mission per se to drive things. And there is one being built up to, but it's not there yet, so they're not really aware of it. I'm trying to figure out how to balance their reasons for adventuring in the woods with feeling like they have purpose in the campaign.
That was one thing that I ended up doing when I ran it, was right off the bat, since we had 3 bear folk in the party, is I kind of had the Bear King as like their Fey patron that was immediately pointing them towards stuff that he wanted them doing. But it also helped that we had that theme going, that 3 people were like, I want to play a bear. I want to play a bear. I want to play a bear.
I mean, we do have Nevrim, who is now a warlock with the forest itself as his patron. But I've been trying to play the forest as a little more hands-off. Like, she'll give him like nudges to things, but it's generally a little more hands-off in letting him prove himself to her.
So for my journal, I am going to say I don't have a journal. Part of this is April was really bad for the Curse of Strahd group. They just have a bunch of other stuff going on, and we just could not pull anything together. They want to do 2 in May. We'll see if we can actually pull that off. But also, our Tales of the Valiant game that's on the other Saturday, I had to bump back because I had a union meeting, so I got nothing for you. Now it is time for our Eldritch Invocation. We've got a Patreon to help us keep doing this show. In addition to keeping the lights on, we also provide additional content meant to help make your games better. Currently, we've got various posts granting advice on a range of topics you'll face as the GM. We've also got crunchy material bits like Ancestry Origin feats, alternate XP rules, and a look at our Masters of the Universe-inspired Daggerheart campaign frame. We'd love it if you would come and join us to support our show. And we have a Discord that anyone can come join. Come over and have a chat. You can find us at patreon.com/THAC0WA.
Welcome to the Dungeon Master's Workshop.
Moving on into the Dungeon Master's Workshop. While exploration and combat are major components of running D&D, or most fantasy games, to truly make the setting feel lived in, you have to mix in social encounters. But what do you do when the majority of your players use charisma as their character's dump stat? How do we make social encounters more interesting than a pass-fail on a persuasion check? Let's dig into it. So first up, since we do touch on the history of D&D here, how did older editions handle social encounters, especially the editions before skills were a thing?
I love the fact that there are times when I remember a certain way of resolving it, and I cannot remember whether it was like from the basic red box set or from AD&D, so I have to go back through all of my stuff to figure this out. But in basic D&D and in BECME, it was you roll 2d6, you might have a charisma modifier, and that would tell you on a chart whether something wants to attack you, whether they're aggressive, cautious, neutral, or friendly.
I have a question.
Yes.
How were modifiers set up in older editions? Because I have to confess that when we were setting up the notes for this, I thought that charisma was not a stat in original D&D. And I ended up going forth and finding the single character sheet I have from the old days. And she did have charisma, but she had a 5 charisma.
The modifiers were a lot more like at the extreme ends. So, for example, if you had an 18, you might have a +2. It wasn't the, +1 for every 2 that you have above 10 like it is now. It's more like you could have up to like a 15 and it didn't matter. It was just kind of like knowing that you were more charismatic than someone else in a way that was completely immaterial to the game. It is very obvious the way this is set up that it is like, if you run into someone that's neutral but that could potentially attack you, see if you aggravate them into actually attacking you, as opposed to you're going to have a deep conversation with someone where you need to resolve a complex social situation. Here's how you resolve it. The funny thing is AD&D is almost exactly the same thing, except it was having you roll percentile dice instead of the 2d6 plus modifier, which means the modifier for charisma in AD&D was a percentile bonus instead of just a flat number bonus.
Oh, I hate percentiles.
That would have you go from either violently hostile to enthusiastically friendly. That was, I mean, there was a whole range. There was like violently hostile, uncertain but negative, neutral, uncertain but positive, friendly, and enthusiastically friendly. That's your range of responses to you. When you get into AD&D 2nd edition, this was kind of interesting because at this point, they add 4 different columns, and those 4 columns are based on how the PCs approach the situation. So, like, if you are trying to be, like, intimidating, you would use one column. If you were trying to be really nice, you would use a different column. So now it kind of cared a little bit more about you, how you were doing this, and it was kind of telling you there might be a narrative behind what you're doing, not just, I show up, what did my charisma do to him? And so it was still kind of, you know, shook out to be friendly, indifferent, cautious, threatening, or hostile. But they also, and I know this is going to sound like it's not a big deal at all, but this was revolutionary when you read the other 2 that I had just mentioned. They said you could say an NPC already just has one of these dispositions before you even roll. It's okay to decide that an NPC might like the PCs before you even make them roll.
Or dislike them.
Entirely, yeah. Honestly, I mean, that goes along with 2nd edition because that's when a lot more narrative-heavy storylines existed in the adventures that got published, too. So you didn't necessarily want them walking up to the quest giver and saying, well, I guess you want to murder us now. Yep, no quest for you. 3rd edition had a range of DCs. There was a table with DC things that went from like 15 to like 25, and actually I think it went up to 30. In this case, you weren't randomly rolling to see what the NPC's reaction was, but it was like if you hit a DC 15 for an indifferent person, they may listen to whatever you have to say to them and consider it. So this is where you're getting a little bit more nuance in this idea that, you know, there's a range of things that might happen here. And it's based on skills now because it's 3rd edition, so we now have skills.
Oh boy, did we ever.
Oh yeah. And the other interesting thing about this is you're not rolling to find out what the NPC's initial attitude is. They have an initial attitude. The DM is supposed to decide, what does this DM think of this person? It's whether or not they will deal with you if you ask them for something, or if you need to, you know, get by them for something. Now we're shifting into this, like, this NPC is not a blank slate. You're supposed to have an idea of who they are before this even starts. The thing I think was interesting is when we get to 4th edition, diplomacy has like 2 paragraphs. It has the least about, you know, this whole thing about how NPCs are going to react to you of any of these. It does basically mention that people can end up being friendly, unfriendly, peaceful, or hostile. However, that 2nd paragraph is where it's telling you, hey, this is 4th edition, and if a social encounter has any meaning to it, you're going to set it up as a skill challenge. Which, you know, we will see, like, some of the things we talk about later, we still have skill challenges. It's just that because the name kind of turns people off, we kind of hide it behind how other things are framed.
Yeah, it's interesting how earlier editions were, it feels like earlier editions were more just relying on go with the flow, go with the narrative, go with what the players role play. But as we are going to get into, it is hard for some people to role play being charismatic or charming or trying to be. Sometimes it's hard for them to roleplay being friendly. And as a result, I think in 3rd edition, they're like, well, you can just say your character has a high charisma and a really good persuasion and roll it and see what happens. And you end up with this, I think both styles have their ups and downs with how they function.
Yeah. The other thing that I did want to point out too is I make the joke about how like this NPC is a completely blank slate until you make these dice rolls and now they hate your PCs. That really isn't what they expected, but if you just read the part in the DMG, it doesn't explain that to you. If you read a few like adventure modules, you would get the idea that there are NPCs in this town that already have an opinion of you, and this whole encounter reaction has nothing to do with that. But that's reading and picking up that context from all of these adventures that they're publishing, not from this gigantic DMG that has so many opinions on everything except social situations.
Can we spare a moment and talk about the ridiculousness that was Comeliness?
If we must.
I feel like we do need to touch on this one because it is a trauma from my days playing in the 80s, and I think it's worth talking about how some people attempted to do certain things with this.
It's really funny because I remember thinking this was ridiculous, and we talked about comeliness when we were first talking about all the things we're going to talk about today, and I just remember it's ridiculous to have a stat that tells you how attractive you are. I went and reread the rules for it. It is atrocious. It is as bad as any of those things that we're happy aren't in there. It's as bad as all of the things that are like women can have a strength above 16. It is all of that, because I think this should encapsulate it. Average comeliness is 10. It literally says if you have a 9 comeliness, you are homely enough that people will always have a negative reaction to you unless you have a good charisma. And there is also so much of a hard coding of evil is ugly, good is really good looking, except if, Paladin runs into a really attractive person that has a high comeliness score, and they do anything that they tell them because they now have this fascinate ability because their comeliness score is so high. Now the Paladin loses his Paladin ability, and you didn't actually even get to roll for it because you just thought they were so amazingly awesome looking. And on top of all of that stuff, man, it just hammers that whole, you are extremely attractive to the opposite sex. Comeliness was a very heterosexual stat.
Now, Comeliness was only part of first edition AD&D?
Yeah, it went down in flames as soon as second edition came along. And the funny thing is, it's not like Unearthed Arcana, where it was introduced, was early in first edition. So it kind of showed up on the tail end of first edition, and nobody wanted to keep it alive.
Yeah. No, I remember it because, as I mentioned, the opening show, Awkward Kid, when we were using Comeliness, and there's probably a reason why I thought Comeliness was the version of Charisma in that edition, because there was more focus put on Comeliness.
Mm-hmm.
I also have to point out, I was playing with a couple of guys who were trying very hard to deny that they were not attracted to women. Like, they were more attracted to men.
Uh-huh.
So they were very much trying to put on the front. So there was a lot of like, hot girl, hot. But you had to make sure that your comeliness was good enough so that your character could be treated well, but not so high that they thought you were trying to be all that. You weren't trying to be the girl that's trying to like get all the attention. It was so obnoxious.
One of the things that I was noticing with it too is you have the problem of, if you say this NPC has a 20 comeliness, and then you describe what that NPC looks like, you are now telling the table, this is my description of what a perfectly attractive human being is. You're basically telling the table, if you don't match up to this, I don't think you're attractive. Like, do you really want to do that?
Yeah.
It's just so terrible.
There's a perfectly good reason this died in the fire. It came out, it was there, it was used by some people, and then it disappeared forever once second edition came out. Attractiveness doesn't actually work that way.
Nope.
But you get a bunch of men who don't have a whole lot of experience in seeing that, and you end up with a mechanic that was designed by The precursors to incels, let's just say.
Yeah, that is. I got big pre-incel vibes rereading all of those descriptions of the different things. The other thing that I think is funny, though, was I read about when Gygax was talking about it, and this was not apparently an idea that Gary came up with first, but it was originally presented to him as beauty as a stat. And apparently Gygax wanted to change it to comeliness because if someone had a negative 14 beauty, he thought that would confuse people because the stat is called beauty, but it's at negative 14. So how will you know this person is unattractive?
Oh, Gary.
I know.
I thought you were going to say that they couldn't use beauty because it's not manly enough for the male characters.
I mean, I'm sure that might be part of it too, but...
Yeah, anyway, let's get out of here. Let's move on.
Yeah.
What does 5e offer as rules for social encounters?
So I will say, and we'll get into this a little bit later with one of the videos that we're going to talk about, but 5e is, at least the 2014 rules were a little bit more nuanced than I think people realize when it comes to social encounters. Because I do hear a lot where it's like, okay, you make the one roll and, you know, you blew your persuasion check or your deception check and that's it. When it's talking about this in the DMG, it's saying if you have like a meaningful interaction with an NPC, like you just don't run straight up to them and say, hey, I need you to open this gate for me, but you actually spend a few minutes talking to them, other PCs that are interacting with that NPC can make insight checks, and you can potentially learn traits that this NPC has. And if you work those traits into whatever you're asking them or, you know, whatever you want from them, it might cause their attitude to shift either more friendly or more hostile, depending on which trait you picked up on and how you use it when you finally ask them, hey, I need you to do something for me. Which is a little bit more nuanced than just saying, here's your charisma check. And I don't see a lot of people running with that larger aspect of how this works.
Yeah, I think it is very easy for GMs to just default to the give me a persuasion check and pass-fail that interaction.
I do think part of this also falls down to either you need to know that this is an important NPC where you actually had some traits in mind, or you have to be able to come up with some traits that will make sense, that are meaningful when people are having this interaction with them so that you can throw those traits out. Which does add a little bit more complexity to it. And it could be something that you have to improvise if the PCs randomly run up to some guard that you weren't expecting them to run up to, and they're trying to convince the guard to sound the alarm or something.
Yeah.
Now, 5.5, which we can say now because it's official, it's 5.5. In 5.5, it's interesting because they moved the rules for this into the player's handbook because it is under the influence action. So it's actually defined in the player's handbook, and it tells you, like, the DM will figure out if the NPC is indifferent, friendly, or hostile. The 5.5 rules are a little bit thinner than the 2014 rules, but this is something very important that I think almost every social encounter thing should point out. If you know that an NPC will not do a thing, they will not do a thing. Doesn't matter what the check is. Like, they really heavily underline that. And I know other editions said, well, it's not supernatural influence, so you can't get them to do something they otherwise wouldn't. But I mean, this, I really like the way it's phrased, because it's just like, if they wouldn't do a thing, they won't do a thing. Decide right off the bat whether they'll do a thing or not. And, you know, if the guard would never open that gate to them, it doesn't matter what they roll. But the thing that I'm not super thrilled with is they gave you just one DC. Like in the previous, you know, the 2014 DMG, there's a range. Like, it's easier to talk, obviously, a friendly person into helping you out than somebody that's hostile. In here, they tell you they start off as indifferent, friendly, or hostile, but then the default DC is just 15.
That annoys me.
Yeah. The only difference is like, if you talk to a friendly person and you hit that DC of 15, they might put themselves out for you. Whereas if you get that 15 on a hostile person, you might have to really promise them to do a whole lot of stuff to get them to, like, but it's still the same DC across the board.
Yeah, but there's people that are easier. There should be DCs that are lower for people that are easier to convince to do something, and DCs that may be higher for, you know, like, you don't want to do they would never do this. You want to have it be something you really have to work at convincing them to do. Also, your first, second, third level characters, that means they have to get a 10 or higher on the die if they have a +3 to their charisma and are trained in the skill.
Yeah.
Which makes it even more impossible. You're basically training your players to not try and do social encounters because they're going to fail.
It is interesting, though, because there's one mitigating factor in all of this, which is if the NPC has an intelligence that is higher than 15, you can use their intelligence as a DC instead of 15, which doesn't help with those low-level characters, but it might help if they're talking to, like, a lich and trying to convince them of something, but the lich probably doesn't want to help them anyway, so that's covered by the it'll never help you to begin with. And I guess my problem with that is it shouldn't just be intelligence. In fact, I would almost default to wisdom being more what keeps somebody from listening to you if you're trying to convince them of doing something against their better interests.
Yeah.
The other thing that I don't like is they specifically call out in the influence action, you have to wait 24 hours before you can attempt it again. I don't like the idea, like the way I view this and the way I kind of interpreted this, even though it doesn't expressly say this in the 2014 rules, is if you ask someone to do that, unless some circumstance drastically changes, that's their answer. You can't keep going to them like day after day and asking them the same thing. They're just going to get more upset with you unless something changes, unless you do something like, I'm going to bring you twice as much gold or something. That idea that, well, it's 24 hours, it's time to go talk to the guard again.
It's like,
that just, I don't like that.
That's like toddler mentality of asking for something. If I ask for it often enough, eventually mom's going to say yes. No, mom's just going to get annoyed and put you in the corner or send you to your room.
The important thing to keep in mind, too, is if the PCs are asking for something, that's really what this is about. If you're just talking about they walk up to somebody in a bar and start talking to them and there's not really any stakes, they aren't really asking them for information or asking them to work for them or anything, there's not really a reason to roll that check.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you just want to get an idea of what the NPC thinks of them, but you don't have to do that. That's, I guess, the thing that I'm trying to point out here is, unless this is a situation where you're petitioning an NPC to do something, you don't have to walk through all of these rules like this.
So why is charisma the hardest mental stat for some people to play?
I think part of the problem is if you have someone describe how they fight, they can be completely wrong about how sword fighting works. And as long as it seems action oriented, we buy it. But in our brains, we do start doing this whole thing. If somebody said that to me, I wouldn't be convinced. We start thinking about real human interactions, and we're not thinking about the fact that our PCs are probably doing subtle things using a few different words than we would use when we phrase things. So we're always second guessing that idea that, like, yeah, I could be super, persuasive when I'm talking to somebody, and, people would just stop and listen to me. And I mean, honestly, I'll throw this out here. I think, like, if you have ever heard Ed Greenwood's voice, the man has an amazing voice. That man probably has a higher charisma stat. I can't impersonate Ed Greenwood's voice and sound like him. So no matter what I say, it's not going to sound as cool as when Ed Greenwood says it.
I run Tales from the Loop at gaming conventions quite a bit. It's kids on bikes in the 80s game. These are middle school characters, and they're based on certain archetypes. 99% of the time, the last character chosen is the cool kid. I say, he's a little like Ferris Bueller. He's friends with everybody. He gets along with everybody. He's really charming. And he is still the last character left on the table 99% of the time. And it's because a lot of us are nerds. There's a lot of charisma in the people who play D&D, but a lot of us, even the ones that are charming, that can be social, that can talk, still feel like, oh God, I can't be the cool kid. I can't do the charming thing. I can't play a charismatic character.
Oh, yeah.
And as a result, you have people shy away. Oh, I'm just going to make charisma my dump stat because I don't want to have to try and be charming. This is how I ended up with the party I have in the old Margrave game where, we have a warlock, but the warlock player doesn't want to do anything charismatic. So the party has no face.
Honestly, I think that is a thing. I think imposter syndrome is a big reason why a lot of people have a hard time playing a high charisma character, because even if you do present yourself as being smooth and being inspiring or whatever, you don't believe it. If you don't believe it in real life, it's even harder to believe with your character unless you're just saying, yeah, I'm being super charming. Here's my roll. It's a 23.
Yeah, and when you compare this to intelligence or wisdom, you know, it is a lot easier to lean into the shades of gray with the difference between being unintelligent and intelligent or being wise and unwise. You know, we can play in those areas a little easier than we can play in the charismatic versus uncharismatic.
Yeah.
So it can really be a problem. Or when you want your players, come on, please, somebody just talk to the NPC. I promise I'm not going to hurt you. On the other end of the spectrum, how do we handle the player with a high charisma character who thinks that means they can seduce a dragon or convince anyone of anything? Because we talked about this in the rules, but you still hear all the stories of the bard that seduced the dragon and killed the encounter.
So first off, I think even though we know from statistics the majority of people that are playing 5th edition started playing with 5th edition, there's still a lot of us around that were here for 3rd edition. 3rd edition did this thing that kind of shot themselves in the foot, which was, they say it's not magical, you can't convince somebody to do something they wouldn't normally do. And then you read the epic level handbook and it starts telling you, if you get like a 40 diplomacy check, you can convince somebody to turn over the crown of their kingdom and, you know, name you heir. So then all of a sudden it becomes, wait a minute, does that just mean I have to be epic level and get a 40? Or does that mean, because you can start getting ridiculous numbers before you're epic level in 3rd edition if you try really hard. So then it started turning this into like, well, I just rolled a ridiculous number. You should reward me for rolling that ridiculous number, because otherwise, if it only matters that I roll a 15 or higher and I can get like up to 45, there's no purpose to this. So you should reward me for having this charisma that can get these astronomical numbers. And I think that's still ingrained a little bit with some gamers that were used to that era.
I think this falls into the same category as the don't allow a skill roll unless you are willing to engage with the consequences of success or failure on that roll.
Yes.
Because, you know, we've all heard of the situations where the GM says, yeah, sure, whatever, roll. And then the player gets a nat 20. And at that point, you as the GM are going to come across like a dick if you tell the player they still don't get what they wanted. Even though rules as written, nat 20s don't mean anything on a skill check.
Yeah.
Same thing as a nat 1 doesn't mean anything on a skill check. You have a nat 1 and your rogue has a plus 17 to whatever they're doing, they still got an 18. You know, it's the where are we drawing the lines for that type of thing? And as a result, you get the player who basically does the wild pitch to see if they can do the impossible thing with their high levels of charisma. And if you don't say no right out of the gate, and they still roll and get a 35 or something ridiculous, you know, where are we going with this?
Also, I love Baldur's Gate 3, but I really did a number on those of us running the game as written, trying to tell people 20 doesn't mean anything on a skill check.
Yep. And I mean, to be fair, it's not just Baldur's Gate 3, it's Critical Role.
Oh, yeah.
Critical Role definitely treats all nat 20s as critical success on things.
I think part of this also comes down to, I had a character one time that was supposed to be really good at lying, and I always think about this. And he was just basically like the trickster archetype. You know, he would never go into town and tell people I am my actual name. I always had a cover identity for every town. It wasn't because I was hiding from somebody or trying to get something. It was just what he did. And the GM would always make me roll, and then I would roll stupidly low, and it constantly looked like I was bad at lying. I had like a +7, and I am bad at lying because every single time I talked to someone, I had to roll to prove that I could lie. And I mean, that's the other side of the social thing there too. Anytime somebody is being deceptive, you feel like there are stakes, because the stakes are, does somebody know that you're lying to them or not? But that there's really not. If somebody, like, anybody can lie to you on a day-to-day basis, and if it doesn't mean anything to you, you don't even think about whether or not they're lying. This is where I would say, in these cases, when there is no stakes to something and somebody just wants to feel like their character is charismatic or that their character is a good liar, just treat them like they have a passive deception skill or a passive persuasion skill. You know, if they're going to talk to somebody and, you know, do they think I'm charming? Then you can look and see, well, their wisdom stat is 8 and your passive deception is 16. So yeah, you know, there's no stakes to this. So yeah, you can tell them any story you want and they'll probably fall for it.
In the very early days of the City of Cowls game, our characters were based out of the Kraken's Mall, a bar that was there. And the GM very easily said at the very beginning, he's like, yeah, Dove convinced Jorlim, the barkeep, to give her a room because she's charming and pretty. And she conned him into giving her a room. And anytime he thinks about, hey, she's not giving me any money for this, I should probably do it. He'd like, yeah, you just smile, flirt, whatever, and he'll move on and forget that he needed to try and get some coin out of you for that room. And it was a nice way of allowing me to feel like my character's charisma meant something without it actually having any real stakes in whether it was a success or a failure.
In that case, if there are no stakes to it, your persuasion being like a +8 or whatever is kind of like you saying your character's eyes are blue. It is a statement about your character as much as it is something to roll in an encounter when there are stakes.
Let's take a momentary detour and talk about romance in our games, since I just mentioned flirting. Does this have to rely on charisma? I have opinions on this.
I would definitely say no. There's actually going to be some rules things that I'm going to bring up in some different games and different supplements coming up that it has nothing to necessarily to do with that, because it really is more of a story beat thing. And if you know what the NPC is like, you know what the PC is like, you kind of know how those two interact and whether that's going to make some sense. And there's a whole other thing. You should listen to Pandas Talking Games, because they just did multiple episodes on romance in games. If you want to talk about the nuance of making sure that everybody's on board with it and that it is a positive experience for everyone. But just speaking from the mechanical standpoint, it should not just be a charisma thing.
I would even go as far to say is you should not hinge every social interaction on charisma, because, you know, that's going to basically gatekeep those interactions away from players who don't have a high charisma, you know, who still may want to engage in social role play with the NPCs that are in your world. There are plenty of us that have had romance in our lives and we're not super charismatic. So it doesn't have to rely on charisma. But I think as GMs, we should be careful about defaulting to charisma being the, I'm not going to say those words that came to my head because that would be awkward. You shouldn't rely on charisma to be the thing that makes all things possible.
Yeah.
With interactions between characters.
I can understand if what you are establishing in a scene is basically like a character trying to have a one-night stand. Sure. Roll your persuasion. You're standing out from the crowd, whatever. But if you're actually talking about a real romantic relationship, that is way deeper than just whether or not you had the right words the first time you met someone.
I enjoy romance in games. It doesn't happen often enough because a lot of people find it too awkward.
Mm-hmm.
Those Panda Talking Games episode are really worth listening to as far as that goes. But there should be relationships between characters. It doesn't even have to be romantic. There should be relationships between the PCs and with NPCs in the world. And those should not be predicated on the PC having a high charisma. There should be connection that happens separate from just whether or not the character is good at talking to people.
I almost said something about Aramon, but I was like, yeah, but Aramon does have a high charisma. So never
Aramon
mind.
has a high charisma. Yeah. No, I was kind of thinking about Kazina. Kazina does not have charisma. I enjoyed playing Kazina because she'd put her foot in her mouth all the time, and she was really good at reading people.
Well, and see, that's what's kind of interesting about how the 2014 DMG spelled things out, because that actually should be an important aspect of interacting with NPCs. You can have the person that is just good at reading people, not necessarily being the person that's trying to convince the person to do a thing. But like you said, also, maybe like once you make that insight check and figure out that this guy is really a big history buff, maybe you making a history check is what convinces them to do something.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a slight tangent from the romance question, but I think it is also okay to sometimes swap the attribute that you're rolling with a skill.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have a wizard who is trying to talk another wizard into doing a thing, roll intelligence plus persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
Because at that point, it's like, I know all this stuff and I want you to do this stuff with me. Here, let's talk. Or the acrobat trying to do something cool to impress somebody. Roll dexterity and persuasion. I wouldn't recommend doing this all the time, but you can get flexible with this.
I mean, I would even say, like, you can think of a lot of instances of this, but like, let's say you have a character that's a tactician in a war meeting and he's trying to convince people, like, no, we should actually attack over here. That can very easily be an intelligence check that person is making, not a charisma check, because he's explaining if we go this way, it's going to, draw out our resources. If we go this way, there's all this stuff that you never thought of. Maybe they could close a whole waterway that people never mentioned that they could close off, even though it's very obvious and other presidents never. Oh, I'm sorry. Never mind.
Jenny D recently did a video on how Draw Steel does social encounters, and I think it's pretty interesting from what she was saying. I haven't had a chance to read the rules, but I think if we can, let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I did get a chance to go through this, and I like a lot of what they do there. They do specifically call out that this is for negotiations. So, as we said earlier, this is about this NPC has something, or I need them to do something, so I need to convince them about something. It's not just, hey, does this guy like me? Because that's just either you decide it or it's a check. It's not an extended scene that you need to do for something like that. But if it's, hey, I would like you to send your mercenaries over on this ridge and back us up over here. And that's what a negotiation is supposed to be about. It's those kind of things where there are, again, stakes to what you're trying to convince somebody about. I'm going to completely forget what the terminology is for all of these different things because I read through them, but it doesn't mean I remember terminology because I'm still struggling to remember what the names of skills are in 5th edition. Basically, you have multiple things that are ranked from 0 to 5 in this situation. The NPC will have a certain amount of patience that is ranked, usually at least at 1, because 1, if it's at 0, they don't listen to you at all. That is essentially how many chances you have to make a good impression on them. If they have a patience of 5, you make 5 checks and they still haven't gotten a good impression of you, they're done listening to you. You're not going to convince them of anything else. It's kind of the time limit on the encounter. No matter what else happens, you're dealing with that time limit. The other thing is they have a specific list of different NPC motivations. There is a constrained list. It's not anything. It's going to be one of these 20 things. I don't remember exactly how many there are, but there's like a broad range of things. And your character could, when they're interacting, say, I'm going to appeal to this type of motivation. If that is something that is what the NPC cares about, you would get a bonus on that particular role because you appeal to that. On the other hand, that same character might have a trait that says, if you appeal to that, you're going to fail automatically. You messed up. You should not have brought that up. So you're basically looking at this list of motivations and picking which ones you want to appeal to if you want to try that, because there is that risk reward. You might get a bonus for it, but you might get a penalty for it. You can also, however, while you're interacting with them, make checks to try and pick up on what their motivations actually are so that you're not guessing at it.
Hence that insight roll.
Exactly. And the number of, basically depending on how high you roll and how high above that you roll, you put them at a certain level where they'll help you, but you got to do a lot to get, you got to promise them a lot, or they are enthusiastically on your side. And you just have that, their patience is whittling down every time you make that check on them. And that's essentially how it plays out. So there are multiple mechanical widgets going on in there. You just have to be aware of the structure, but there is definitely a structure. It's not just freeform.
I think it sounds interesting. I like the idea of the NPC having kind of a motivation and an anti-motivation.
Yeah.
And like if the characters ping on the wrong one, it just skews the encounter in the wrong direction they wanted it to go.
What's really funny is in that Jenny D video, she mentions that once she went back and reread the 2014 rules, she was like, oh, a lot of this is already in here. It's just not formalized as much.
Yeah.
And she made a really good point in that it is a little bit more freeform because, Draw Steel is saying, here is the list of motivations. Every NPC will have some variation of these motivations. Whereas in D&D, it's whatever the DM thought of. So if you're just trying to guess at something, it's going to be a lot harder to do that if you're not making that insight check and actually finding out what it is.
I can see pros and cons with both styles, because I am sure there will come a point if I were running Draw Steel where I would look at that list and go, none of these fit.
Yeah, it's kind of the PBTA problem. Like, sometimes it's like, if they do this, they can choose from these options. I don't like any of those options.
Yeah, none of these options work. This sucks. I want to do something different. And so you're going to end up making something up anyway, unless you are trying to stay really adherent to the rules.
I like the idea. This is where I was going to say, we really still have skill challenges. It's just we're a little bit better at not saying this is a skill challenge that runs like every other skill challenge. You are now engaging with the skill challenge because that patience level is basically the limiter. Like in a skill challenge, if you fail this many times, the skill challenge is over. But instead of it seeming like this arbitrary, I failed 3 times, so it's over, what you're actually saying is something in the narrative. This NPC is very impatient. You've got 2 chances to convince them, and I like that fact that there's a built-in timer for that. It's not going to go on forever, but sometimes you'll have a little bit more leeway to make this argument than other times.
Right. Are there any other cool ways to handle social mechanics in other game systems?
The one thing that I wanted to touch on that it was really neat is she read through this and goes, this is a lot like the 2014 rules. I was reading through it and thinking, this is a lot like the Adventures in Middle-earth, the D20 version that came out before when Cubicle 7 had it, their audience system. Because their audience system was basically you make an introduction, which determines how friendly the NPC is to you. Everyone says what they're doing during the audience, because it's assumed you're not just going to go in to talk to Theoden and say, Theoden, we immediately need you to do this thing. There's going to be some kind of interaction there. You might be sitting there through a meal or something. So everybody says what they do. If somebody says something like, I am going to listen to all of his jokes and laugh at them, you might say, okay, that's a +1. And somebody else says, I am going to sit here and not drink any of this wine because I don't like wine. And then you go, okay, that's a -1. And you keep track of all of those bonuses of what people did during the audience. And then when that's over, the person that's going to make the final petition makes the roll with that bonus up or down in the end to see whether that NPC listens. And part of what that was is there was a thing. If you mention X to this NPC, you will either fail or you have disadvantage. Whereas if you mention this to this NPC, because they're really for this, you're going to have advantage or whatever. And that I was like, wow. I mean, this was something straight out of there too.
Yeah.
The One Ring 2nd edition, which is kind of based on the original system that, all of this stuff kind of came from, that has basically a thing where you have a certain number of successes that you need to get when you're doing an audience. It does still do the whole introduce yourself to see how hard it's going to be to do this, and then, make your final petition. It doesn't quite have the thing in between where you're talking about what everybody is doing, but it does have, like, if you are just asking to stay somewhere for hospitality, that's like a 1. That's nothing. If you're asking somebody to send, their personal honor guard with you somewhere, that might be a 3. So you're going to need to get those 3 different successes there. Legends in the Mist is kind of like this because it is very much like this Fate PBTA game, like hybrid. There's like a magnitude to how well you do something, and there are resistances on the other side. And if you match the magnitude of the thing you're trying to do, so if the magnitude is 5 to convince somebody of something socially, and you roll 5 more than what you needed to get, then you did it. But if they have some other trait that takes 2 off of that, you haven't convinced them yet. It is interesting because it's a lot of playing with narrative tags and how much of a bonus that tag has. One of the other things I wanted to touch on too is Fantasy Age. This is not about rolling for anything, but in Fantasy Age, you can have relationships. And when you have relationships, it gives you a skill stunt point reserve that you can just use if it is something that involves the person you have a relationship with. Which I thought was kind of interesting. It's a neat way to kind of establish bonds between people.
Yeah, that is a neat way.
And then A Life Well Lived, which is like one of the great... Go buy A Life Well Lived, especially if you're running 5th edition, because there's just like a ton of great stuff in there.
Such a good book.
There are like downtime endeavors for like making a new contact or for convincing somebody that you are a good person that you can do during your downtime, which is, you know, kind of like you make your 3 rolls, and if you whittle away the final difficulty and you get it down to 0 or lower, then you're successful. If you're not, then you haven't done it yet, but you might be able to keep working on it. The other thing that it does is it basically just says there's a downtime for you to spend time with either a close friend or a romantic interest. You are not rolling to see this. This is you talk to the DM and say, I would like to have a love interest. Okay, that makes sense. Here is your love interest. Okay, we have downtime. I would like to spend time with them. And when a situation comes up that would remind you of that friendship or that love interest, you get inspiration immediately.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, some of this is not active social situations, but they are social things. They're reasons for your character to have ties to people that isn't just about combat bonuses.
What are some best practices we as GMs can put into play to encourage players to engage in social encounters, even if they don't have a charismatic character? How do I get my characters in the old Margrave game to engage with NPCs?
I definitely think anytime they are engaging with an NPC, think about what other skills would positively dispose them towards the PC. So like we were saying, if the wizard can like explain something in terms of a magical puzzle, like we need your help because we need to figure out this one ward that is controlling this one area, you can let them make an Arcana check for that because they're presenting that magical puzzle in a way that is intriguing to the NPC. You know, look for other skills that would appeal to that NPC so that you can draw those in and let the PCs use those.
Remember that just because a character doesn't have a bonus in charisma doesn't mean they're not going to be social.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they're not going to have relationships and conversations and engagement with other NPCs or characters in the world. 10 is average. 10 is like normal. You know, you bump that up to a 12 with a +1 and hey, somebody's a little charming. You know, it's the don't use a DC of 15 for every time the players want to talk to somebody. Please don't. We want to encourage them to engage with characters. So if you are going to require a roll for anything, sometimes gauge the stakes there.
I'd also say, like, you know, you're just talking about how even if you don't have a high charisma, you're not going to not be social. I'm thinking, I know plenty of people in real life that I feel like might have a low charisma that are social all the time, even when you don't want them to be. There's this thing called social media that is filled with a lot of those people. The other thing I would say, and this is something, Chris is really good at this, and I try and do this, sometimes it's not even about pass or fail. It's about the higher you roll, the more important thing that you get is. Which means, in this case, even if your low charisma people are the ones that start talking, they won't necessarily fail. They just may not get the tip top of what you had planned.
Mm-hmm.
So don't necessarily look at it as it's a DC 15 to get anything. Think of it more as if you can get a 5, you're going to get something out of them. You know, if you can get a 10, you're going to get it something a little bit better.
Yeah.
Brennan Lee Mulligan does this a lot too in Critical Role.
Don't punish a player with a low charisma character if they start talking with somebody by suddenly going, okay, now give me a charisma roll.
Yeah.
You know, now give me a persuasion roll when you know that they have a negative to that roll.
Yeah.
That's telling them, don't even try this. Don't even engage with the NPCs because you're going to get punished. Let them talk. Let them role play. We want the role playing, and you don't want to stop the role playing by calling for a roll. This is a complete tangent. I was playing a game at Gen Con. It was a newly released game. I'm not going to name it. And the GM kept going on, this brings the role playing to the role playing. And like, you know, he was doing RLE in one point and ROLL in another point. But what pissed me off, there were a lot of things that pissed me off about this game. It was probably my worst Gen Con game I've ever played. The thing that pissed me off is we finally had a scene where people were role-playing and it was getting fun, and he immediately stopped and forced us to start rolling some things because this might induce some stress. And it's like, I don't care if it induces stress. You just stopped the one spark of joy I had in this entire game you've been running.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if the role-playing is going well, don't stop it for a roll. You know, you can still call for rolls when it's important and when it matters, but like, you still want the role-playing to happen. Last thing before we get out of here, do we have any advice for players who want to try a charismatic character for the first time?
I would point out that someone describing how their character does something is still role-playing.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody wants to tell you the general idea of what they're saying, but then say, but I used much better words for it, let them do it.
Yes, absolutely. It is absolutely okay to state up front what the intention of your conversation is. I am approaching this NPC with a friendly demeanor, and I want to banter with them and then get this information out of them. It is okay to state up front what you are attempting to do and not try and role play your way into it. Because the role playing is fun. We want it, but your actions may not be what the GM is perceiving. Let me rephrase that. The intentions of your actions may not be picked up by the GM to understand what to give you out of that scene.
Yeah.
So it is okay to describe what you want to do before you pick up the dice or try and role play it through. It's like, we want, you know, we talked about this at the beginning of the game, where the earlier editions left this like a lot up to the narrative and the role playing, especially second edition, it sounds like. And then third edition brought in the dice rolls with the skill checks, because there were a lot of times where that role playing to try and get what you wanted didn't work. Mm-hmm. So, you know, like trying to role play a charismatic character and not feeling like you're doing it well enough to get what you want. Okay, let's have a number attached to this. Let's do the roll. I can get what I want and be that charismatic character. Let's have a mix of the two. You can have the character be charismatic on paper, and then just explain to the GM, this is what I'm trying to get, and this is how I'm trying to do it. So they have an idea of how that scene is supposed to go once you start trying to do some of the role-playing in it.
Yeah.
I actually love playing charismatic characters. In fact, I told Jared the next campaign he runs, I'm going to play a charisma character because I'm tired of playing a non-charisma character and dying inside as we can't do anything because nobody in the party can talk to anybody.
It is still storytelling if somebody tells you, I am going to walk up to this person and turn on my best Lando Calrissian charm. You know what that means. Everyone at your table, if they've seen Star Wars, knows what that means. So you have an idea of what this character is doing. Don't penalize them if they don't have the exact words for the conversation.
Yes.
This is a thing that like became a big deal in third edition because there were people that were such proponents for, if somebody role plays a charismatic character really well and they're super charismatic in real life, you should give them a bonus to that role. It's like, no, you shouldn't. Because the flip side of that is if somebody is socially awkward, you're telling them you are going to be penalized in this game no matter what you do with your stats.
Yeah. That feels like it was a carryover from second edition days where you actually had to be charismatic to play a charismatic character.
I think it was also kind of this weird, like, I need to promote role playing and not just, mechanical knowledge, but it's not really what that's doing. That's shutting people out and intimidating them, actually.
Yeah, I am not a genius. I am not a genius by any stretch of the imagination. I certainly am not the wisest person in the world. But I have no hesitation at playing an 18 intelligence or an 18 wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So why should I hesitate to play an 18 charisma? Because I stumble over my words and I can't flirt.
The flip side of that argument is if you have somebody at the table that is like a black belt in karate that can explain to you exactly how combat should work, you don't give them a bonus because they tell you that you're explaining combat wrong. Like, that's not how we play this game.
Ultimately, what I'm going to say is try the charisma character. Try a bard, try a sorcerer, try a warlock who's charming and just the character everybody wants to have sit down and have a drink with. Try it. It's not going to hurt. Hopefully your GM is willing to work with you on this. It can be a lot of fun. It can open so many doors to just be like, hey, I'm going to talk to these people and try and get something instead of, like me having to shove the characters with charisma in the direction of the people that need to be talked to.
And honestly, eventually you may want to develop a better vocabulary for this. But if you are just going to say how your character approaches something and not necessarily try and come up with the words yourself, start thinking about characters that that you want to present. Like, if you're going to say it, I say this like Lando Calrissian or like Loki, think about those charismatic characters that you want to channel with your character and use that as your touchstone when you explain the approach that your character is taking.
Now let's join Ange and Jared for some downtime research, where they do the work so we don't have to.
Every episode, we're going to look for something related to D&D that we want to pass along to our listeners. It might be products, websites, videos, or podcasts, but it will always be something that we think will enhance your D&D experience or make you sad in my case, but we'll get to that.
Are you ready, crawlers? This is probably going to be old news to anyone listening to this, but Dungeon Crawler Carl RPG Backer Kit has launched to massive success. The last I looked, they were sitting at over 7 million. So you might say this one has generated a teeny little bit of excitement. I am interested to see what they do with this and if they can get something even remotely close to the bonkers over-the-top gameplay that a Dungeon Crawler Carl game is going to need. As a side note, we're about to see a war of who gets to use DCC. I see folks unfamiliar with Dungeon Crawl Classics already using it for Dungeon Crawler Carl. So this is going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. Dungeon Crawl Classics actually has kind of the history to use it, but Dungeon Crawler Carl is really popular. We'll have a link to the Back Your Kit in the notes.
These last couple weeks, I keep seeing DCC and going, wait a minute, that's not about Goodman Games.
Yeah, there's a group chat I'm in where somebody mentioned the DCC Backer Kit and everyone was talking about it. And I kind of commented that, it took me a minute to realize, they're talking about Dungeon Crawler Carl, not Dungeon Crawl Classics. And somebody else was like, yeah, I thought they were talking about Dungeon Crawl Classics.
We live in interesting times.
Yeah.
In somewhat of a segue, because he made some of the dice that they use for Dungeon Crawl Classics possible, including the D30 and the D24 and the D16. Unfortunately, Luz Ochi has passed away. And if you don't know that name, Luz Ochi's Game Science Company was the first company to make polyhedral dice in the United States. He's been a staple at many, many conventions over the years. He worked as a wargame designer before founding Game Science, and in the early days of the industry, he actually did a lot to help some of the newer companies figure out how to market their games and get them into game stores. I'm going to link to some articles talking about his life and his work, and I'll drop a link to in the show notes for going to Game Science so you can kind of see the unique, very precise dice that he was always an advocate for making.
He was an interesting guy, and if you ran into him, at the convention, because he was always in his booth in the dealer's hall, he'd happily talk your ear off for however long you were willing to stand there and listen.
I loved as I was reading, like, how many of some of the early RPG companies he actually helped talk through, like, this is how you get this game into a store. This is what you need to do next. I love that kind of community feel.
We are happily part of the Polygamers Podcast Network, helping you run and play your best games. We think you'll enjoy another Polygamers podcast like
Under the Lamplight. Under the Lamplight is a Streets of Avalon RPG companion podcast where Brett and Chris talk about the setting and the game. Streets of Avalon RPG is a low fantasy urban RPG focused on the stories of the people living in a city of classism, corruption, and decay, while trying to bring a little light into their lives and the lives of the people closest to them.
We have used up all of our resources, so I think it's time for a long rest. I hope this adventure was rewarding for you, and we hope you go exploring with us when we start our next adventure.